Hey dears, welcome back to Sleepless Thrills. Tonight's story is about cold things, cold winds, cold bones, and cold secrets that never thawed. Before you drift off inside your warm blanket fortress, let's take a soft, slow step back, not just in time, but into the ice. 2 grand ships, over 100 men, strong, clever, proud, and every single one of them would vanish. No trace, no rescue, just whispers caught in snowdrifts and buttons scattered across the Arctic like lost teeth. But you're safe here, I promise. You're not stuck in an ice trap, you're in bed. Just don't forget to tap like and subscribe before the frost sets in. Keeps the cold out. Somehow, the Franklin expedition was meant to conquer the Northwest Passage. Instead, it became a bedtime mystery, carved in frozen silence. What lies ahead is not just a mystery. It's a descent into frostbitten fear, whispered journals, gnawed bones, and one long, slow unraveling. So fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? And what unsolved shadow should we dream through next? Let's vanish now, softly, into the white wilderness where no footsteps ever returned. They departed in glory. 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, gleamed on the Thames, ready to chase a dream across ice that refused to yield. Crowds on the dock pressed in thick woolen coats, waving kerchiefs and shouting blessings. Bands played triumphant anthems, and children scampered after seagulls, mouths open as if to swallow destiny whole. Sir John Franklin, at 60 winters, stood at the gangway of Erebus in a crimson coat, fur collar upturned. His beard was a silver halo, his eyes alight with pride. He believed he'd mastered Arctic lore. He thought himself ready. All of England believed in him too. Parliament, the Navy, even the tabloids. But the ice had its own designs. Below deck, Surgeon Harry Goodsir inspected crates labeled tinned beef, lemons for scurvy, and cocoa. He sized each tin like a surgeon probing a patient. Add whiskey to everything, he told the cook, for medicinal fortitude. The men laughed, tucking tart lemons and hardened biscuits into their pouches, not realizing the bitterness would soon taste like fate. Lieutenant James Fitzjames practiced scales on a hand-cranked organ, claiming music would keep the spirits of the ice at bay. He had also smuggled a cheeky monkey aboard, a tiny jester that chattered at officers, earned itself the title His Majesty of the Cold. On deck, he juggled flares and declared, "If darkness threatens, at least we'll sparkle." 129 souls set sail. Sailors, marines, engineers, an earnest librarian, and a poet who carried a pen sharper than any icicle. They boarded eagerly, each with journals, compasses, and a quiet terror they kept to themselves. Their uniforms were starched, their boots polished. They believed this was a conquest, not a burial. On May 19th, 1845, Erebus and Terror slipped into the North Sea. London's mist receded, families wept. Franklin's wife pressed a final letter into his hand, her fingers trembling. He kissed her cheek, confident. She did not know her prayers would linger in empty air. They stopped at Stromness in the Orkneys, where sailors rushed to mail last letters home. They purchased thick socks, sturdy boots, wool before wool, and returned to their posts, certain of a swift passage. No sign of doom. At Disco Bay, Greenland, they paused to restock. Fresh water, seal blubber, supplies. 5 men were left behind, sick, homesick, or spooked. They vanished into southern warmth. The rest pressed deeper, past whale-spouting seas and iceberg cathedrals. They entered Lancaster Sound in July, and the sun never truly set. The sky glowed pale gold, melting into lavender. Icebergs drifted like frozen cathedrals afloat. Erebus and Terror moved steadily among them, tools of iron and steam, hulls designed to crush flows. The men sketched the surreal landscape, tall blue walls, seals peering like curious children, and the ghostly glow of glittering snow. Below decks, life remained civilized. Officers dined on china and silver, toasting "To our safe return." The library groaned under volumes of Shakespeare, Scott, and sea yarns. One man tucked Robinson Crusoe under his bunk and wondered if teeth ever freeze with regret. Canned beef, mutton, peas, and plum pudding filled the pantries. Men marveled at canned coffee, liquid gold in a world of frost. But the Arctic watched. Ice shifted strangely. Fog lingered like a portent. Whispers drifted among the men of half-seen shapes, skating across the floe, vanishing like painted shadows. Some swore they heard voices in the wind, half English, half howl. Others wrote euphemisms in their journals, chalking it up to sea madness and midnight illusions. Late August brought ill omens. The sea froze in layers, locking the ships in a white vice. A thunderous crack sounded as ice slammed against hulls. Below deck, gear rattled in tight cubbyholes. Lanterns flickered. Franklin wrote in his journal, "Latitude 75 degrees north, icebound for the winter. Spirits remain high." He underlined high twice, the ink trembling. Above, auroras danced green and violet across a bruised sky like ribbons of glass. Men on deck stared, drinking in the eerie light, every face etched with awe. They did not know the show was for their funeral. At dinner that evening, they tried normalcy. "Mutton tomorrow," someone joked. Candles carved from turnips glowed. They sang hushed carols. Laughter echoed like a hollow bell. When Fitzjames reminded them, "Lower your voices, gentlemen," they complied, though each note felt brittle as a frostbitten bone. Outside, the snow began to fall, tapping on portholes like tiny fingers. The ice pressed ever closer, a slow, patient prisoner. Erebus groaned. Terror sighed. The two ships, once proud, now felt like tombs in waiting. "Listen, dear sleeper. Feel the hush. The Arctic is swallowing them. Slowly. But not yet. Hold this moment. The cold has only just arrived." The first frost settled like a silent verdict. As summer's pale light waned, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror felt the Arctic's iron grip. Ice closed around their hulls until the ships could no longer stir. Engines stuttered and died, leaving timber and iron frozen in a brittle embrace. Below decks, the clatter of cutlery ceased. Candlelight flickered against the dark wood, casting long shadows where laughter once lived. Sir John Franklin paced in a cabin, the soles of his boots echoing hollowly. A man caught between roles of leader and prisoner, he fingered a map that tapered into white nothingness. Beyond that lay a realm of frost and hunger. He ordered provisions counted and rations measured. Supplies were ample, but time was the enemy. In the mess hall, officers clustered around a single lamp over chipped china. Lieutenant Fitzjames toyed with a silver fork, its tines glinting like tiny daggers. He joked about writing memoirs titled "Arctic Woes and Frozen Toes," but his voice shook. Surgeon Goodsir inspected frostbitten wounds, grimacing. "Lack of vitamin C will make us turn on each other," he warned, half in jest, half in dread. Outside, the temperature plunged. A hush reigned. broken only by the creak of ice and the hiss of wind against iron. Below deck, sailors carved playing cards from scraps, playing poker with chipped clay marbles. They bet with promises. I'll swap my hat for your last pouch of cocoa. The stakes grew grim. They began constructing sod huts on the ice, using blocks of frozen earth and timber from dismantled deckhouses. The huts were crude, low, and cold. Franklin's logs noted rudimentary but livable was a word that sank as quickly as a lead anchor in deep water. In each hut, men huddled around smoldering lanterns, sharing scraps of news. Ray's report says, no rescue until spring. Rations to last 6 months. Eyes widened. What then? Night stretched into an endless expanse. The auroras returned, weaving spectral ribbons of emerald and violet through the sky. A macabre ballet above a frozen grave. Men watched from portholes, wide-eyed. Some swore the lights whispered names, long-forgotten sailors begging for warmth. Food grew scarce. The tinned meat began to taste odd, rancid even, puckering lips like sour ale. Surgeon Goodsir recorded symptoms of lead poisoning in journals. The iron plates, soldered to tins, leached toxins. Some men grew gaunt, eyes sunken as doll heads. Morale dropped with each brittle snowfall. In December, able seaman Torrington disappeared from his watch. They found his bundle of clothes by a thin patch of ice. No footprints, only whispers of wind. The men said he walked into the fog, guided by ghosts. Franklin's log entry read simply, Torrington gone. Sea claimed him. Terror's carpenter cracked a tooth on a frozen hardtack and swore it was a sign. Another morning revealed broken tools on the ice, as if something had tested their strength. They blamed shifting flows, but inside they wondered if the void watched from a distance, shadows too dark to name. In January's cold, the infirmary filled. Scurvy took several. One by one they collapsed, skin bruised like grapes, gums bleeding. Surgeon Goodsir tried fresh seal liver, but it arrived too late for many. He buried bones in the snow, marking graves with wooden crosses. Each cross was a prayer and a threat. The same fate might claim them all. One night, Private White dreamt of his mother's kitchen, warm hearth, fresh bread. He woke to find frost on his blanket. He whispered, "Mother, forgive me," and slipped quietly into ice forever. They found him in the grain stores, face frozen in an expression of relief. Franklin held a council to maintain order. Rations were halved. Men shared blankets in tight clusters. The Arctic was a cold god demanding tribute. They offered lives. Some turned to religion. At dawn, they sang hymns over the snow, voices echoing like church bells in the void. They prayed for rescue, for mercy they doubted would come. With every passing day, the ice tightened its circle. Erebus and Terror stood stoic, their timbers frost-bound. Their names meant nothing now. They were just wood, iron, and the ghosts of men who once believed. In February, the ice groaned as if alive, splitting wide fissures that glowed with malevolent light. The men dared not cross. On the horizon, a lone polar bear silhouette drifted, curious as a phantom. Inside, whispers grew. "It watches us," they said. Through a porthole, a single beam of pale sun shone on Elliot's grave. Tiny cross of driftwood marking a boy who never knew childhood. Franklin's own hand trembled as he wrote, "Winter deepens. Hope is fragile. The ice now sings cruel lullabies, and each breath hums warning. Spring teased the horizon, but the Arctic did not budge. Erebus and Terror remained trapped in their icy tombs, each day a pale repetition of the last. The men, once lively and boastful, now moved like wraiths against the snowfield. Their cheeks were sunken hollows. Their voices, when they spoke, sounded thin and brittle. Sir John Franklin convened a council in the largest sod hut, its walls sweating from melting snow. He addressed the captains, officers, and weary sailors. "Gentlemen, the ice shows no mercy," he began, boots creaking against frozen planks. "We will move south to Back River. Perhaps there we shall find rescue." His gaze swept Captain Crozier's gaunt face, whiskers flecked with frost. Crozier saluted quietly, masking dread. Outside, the aurora flared one last time before fading. Men on deck strained to see the spectral ribbons before darkness swallowed them. Below, in the mess hall, someone attempted a card game, but usual jokes were gone, replaced by a solemn hush. Tins of game stew were cracked open, revealing gritty lumps. Private Ellis dropped his spoon and stared at his bowl, as if discovering a memory of hunger rather than dinner. They built sledges using spare planks and bulkhead beams, hauling tents, sled dog harnesses, snowshoes, and enough hardtack to feed phantoms. Rations shrank into ration packs labeled 1 day's bread and dried peas. Surgeon Goodsir checked each pack. 5,000 calories per man, barely enough to fuel regret. He offered a half-hearted grin. The men held theirs close to stoke waning hope. On April 12th, the march began. Men stumbled out in single file, faces pressed into wind. A blizzard buffeted them, turning the world into a blank canvas. Franklin led, cloak billowing, boots crunching. Behind trailed sledges of canvases, tents, tools, and enough mutton to haunt dreams. They moved south across fractured floes, rivers of ice trembling beneath them. Every mile felt endless. Snow hummed beneath their boots as though the earth whispered warnings. Their breaths rose in ghostly plumes. Whispers followed, half-forgotten promises of rescue. They camped each evening in makeshift lean-tos, walls of ice blocks and canvas. In those cramped shelters, a dim lamplight revealed grim faces, each sharing scraps of news. Ray's report says no rescue until summer. Eyes widened. Fear lodged itself like a splinter. One night, Private White dreamt of his mother's warm kitchen, fresh bread, crackling fire. He awoke to frost on his eyelashes and disappeared into the still air. Morning found him collapsed near a supply sled, frost rigid in his hair. Franklin knelt and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Another lost?" he whispered, staring at the pail of half-frozen porridge. The words felt hollow. 3 men, too weak to continue, huddled in a sod hut. Franklin offered final prayers over their cots, blankets barely warming stiff bodies. They lay stiff as logs, lips blue as dusk. The hut remained a tomb, code of brothers, now silent to the wind. The survivors pressed on, temperatures plunged further, rivers of slush turned to black ice. The northern wind sheared flesh, caps froze to brows, rations dwindled. Some stashed tiny tea rations, trading crumbs for sips of brandy, as if liquid courage could thaw their souls. In mid-May, they stumbled upon an Inuit camp. Lean hunters emerged, draped in bearskins, eyes bright with knowing calm. They offered boiled seal soup and dried fish. Through broken trade pigeon, they warned, "Food short, no rescue yet. Return when rivers flow." Franklin traded a silver tobacco tin for a handful of seal meat. Hungry men gnawed the raw flesh, tasting warmth on their tongues. In fading daylight, they discovered a previous camp. Ice-gripped tent poles, makeshift graves, scattered journals. One journal lay open under a drift, its pages fluttering in a wind that felt like shivers crawling up their spines. Whose hand had written those desperate notes? Could his own hand write the next entry? Franklin scanned the horizon, numb wind biting at his nose. Crozier patted his back. Onward, Sir John. We rely on the sun's mercy now. The Arctic gave no answer. Later, at sunset, the sky glowed a fleeting pink, as if the Arctic offered a final blush of life. Each man paused, chin quivering against biting wind, to witness the dying light. They huddled close, sharing a flask of rancid spirits, memories flickering like candle embers in their eyes. Some spoke daringly of home, recipes for roast dinners, the smell of spring flowers, though outside the ground was locked in frozen regret. One sailor, imploring relief, raised a thin voice. "I'd trade my boots for a loaf of bread." The reply came not from a leader, but from the wind. "No bread here, only more ice." In that moment, even hope seemed a stranger. Their shadows grew long and skeletal on the broken ice, marching with them into a future neither bright nor kind. There are many ways a ship may die. It can burn in a storm, it can founder on hidden shoals, or it can simply be swallowed by a merciless sea. But Erebus and Terror endured the cruelest fate of all. They were frozen in place, condemned to rust and splinter beneath the weight of a silent Arctic winter. On a pale April morning, Captain Crozier summoned the officers to the deck. The sun hovered near the horizon, a dull coin of promise that shed only gray light. Around them, ice floes pressed so tightly against the hulls that even the screech of iron could not shake them free. A hush fell over the crew. This was no mere glitch of navigation. This was a final sentence. "Gentlemen," Crozier began, voice low but steady, "we abandon ship." Sir John Franklin listened, cloak collar upturned, face drawn in frost and resignation. He held a leather-bound journal close, the pages damp with condensation, ready to record the last entry he would ever write aboard these decks. Franklin's silver beard caught a flicker of dawn light as he nodded once. No flourish, only the weight of centuries of exploration pressing on his shoulders. They loaded sledges under a sky of bruised haze, each crate of provisions reminding them how far they'd come and how far they were from home. Sailors hoisted canvas sacks stamped flour and tinned meat onto wooden runners. Medical stores and a single brass sextant were lashed carefully to one sled. Surgeon Goodsir held a small leather pouch containing Franklin's final notes, every word a testament to their stubborn hope. Below deck, engineers stripped lanterns and stowed them in barrels, each flame that went out an echo of the hearths they'd never see again. On deck, Lieutenant Fitzjames removed the Union Jack from the stern, folding it with trembling hands. Nearby, a Marine named O'Donnell paused to shake salt from a stubborn flagpole, his face hollow. The frigid air stole the breath from their lungs, and yet no one dared breathe too deeply. Each gasp felt like a confession of defeat. The men stepped onto the ice, dragging sledges through a thick crust of packed snow. Their footsteps clattered like hollow bells, echoing off the frozen walls of their former prisons. Franklin walked last, pausing to touch the polished rail of Erebus with one gloved hand. "She served us well," he whispered, voice barely audible above the wind. "Forgive us. There was no other way." In unison, 129 souls, officers and sailors alike, turned southward toward the unknown. Their sledges groaned under the weight of everything they owned: tools, journals, cooking pots, even a few treasured books. Some carried silver forks, Others looted chairs from the mess in hopes of warmer days ahead. Each item was a promise of identity: a surgeon's scalpels, an officer's maps, a young seaman's lucky coin. Now all of it would vanish into the same white wilderness. As they marched, sails of ice scraped against the hulls of their ships for one final farewell. On Terror's quarterdeck, a single lantern was left burning, a beacon for lost souls, or perhaps a final invitation for the ice to close in once more. The flames guttered and died, leaving only a hollow glimmer in the dark. Behind them, the ice shifted with a forbidding hush. Erebus and Terror, once mighty vessels of the Royal Navy, slumped in their icy graves, timber, iron, and hope all locked together in a frozen embrace. The fleet of sledges became a slender line on the horizon, moving toward Back River and a promise of rescue that felt as tenuous as the spring thaw. They moved like wraiths through a world of bones, where every rock was a tomb and every gust of wind a requiem. Each man's breath formed ghostly rings in the air, a reminder that life persisted, even as death lurked just beneath the surface. And so, beneath a shell of pink dawn, they pressed onward, leaving behind the husks of two grand ships. For now, the Arctic held its verdict. The sea had let the ships live long enough to freeze, and the men must walk on foot into a silence more chilling than any gale. That morning, they abandoned not just ships, but the last vestiges of certainty. With Erebus and Terror left behind, the survivors faced a world ruled by white and quiet. The sledges, once laden with tins and tools, now felt heavier than before, each man shouldering memories as well as burdens. Snow fell in soft sheets, muffling footsteps until even the wind seemed to hesitate. Captain Crozier stepped onto the frozen plain, the soles of his boots ringing against ice that groaned in protest. Beside him, Lieutenant Hodgson followed, cloak collar upturned, eyes squinting against the drifting powder. The only sound was their boots cutting tracks into the landscape, a thin, fragile line marking their passage. They carried on, day after sunless day, through fields of frost that stretched to the horizon. The ice beneath them was a brittle bride, shivering under each step. Crozier's face was gaunt, his beard glistened with frozen spittle. He used a carved walking stick to test the ice's strength, wary of hidden cracks that might swallow a man whole. Dr. Harry Goodsir walked just behind, journal tucked beneath one arm. He paused to scrape frost from his pen, noting in a trembling hand, April 25th, 1848, we march. Supplies dwindle, the ice sings beneath our feet. His breath hung like a specter, and each word felt like a confession that the journey might end in this vast stillness. Private Lynch, young and thin as a shadow, stumbled to a halt when a flare of color caught his eye. Scarlet lichens clinging to a fractured rock. He knelt, reaching out to touch them with numb fingers, as if searching for proof that life still existed. Frost etched his fingertips, but in that moment, he clung to the tiniest seed of hope. At midday, they paused at the remains of a cairn, stacked stones left by unknown travelers. Crozier knelt, picking up a tin of dried fish and a small bone needle from beneath. Cairn, 6 stones, each with a chip from the cold, a rusted tin half buried. He held the needle in his frost-cracked hands, marveling at how such a simple tool might have once sown warmth into a friend's coat. They lit a meager fire from driftwood and melted a small pot of snow for water. Frostbitten lips parted to sip the lukewarm liquid, tasting the promise of survival. Crozier, sipping from a battered tin cup, eyes closed as if tasting memory. Beside him, Goodsir ladled out dried fish scraps into tin bowls, each man accepting his portion with a hollow nod. By nightfall, the wind rose into a howl, twisting snow into ghostly dancers. They pitched tents near a rock outcrop, leaving just enough shelter to hide from the worst of the blast. Tent cluster, 6 canvas flaps pinned by ice-lashed poles, snow swirling at the entrances. Inside, they huddled on furs, bodies pressed close against the cold that never ceased its advance. Goodsir offered a small ration of pemmican, a gritty circle of dried fat and berries, its taste half hunger and half regret. Crozier took his share, chewing in silence while staring at the tent flaps dancing in the gale. Each crunch of pemmican was a reminder. Strength slipped through their teeth like grain through a sieve. That night, Private Lucas awoke screaming. He claimed he heard voices calling from beneath the ice, names of men long dead. Crozier roused the camp, lantern in hand, only to find Lucas huddled in a corner, eyes wide, as if seeing something no one else could. Lucas, bareheaded, scalp reddened from frost, arms wrapped around himself, he whispered, "They're under us, watching." No one comforted him. Each man felt the same dread, but dared not speak it. The wind roared in their ears, and silence settled like a shroud over frozen campsites. Tents creaked and moaned as if alive, each flap a door to unknown horrors. At dawn, Lucas was found outside. No footprints leading away, no sign of struggle. His tent was empty, except for a single glove. Lucas's glove, wool-lined, coated in frost, fingers splayed as though it had clutched at something. None dared follow the tracks, disappearing into the white. Crozier pressed on, swallowing his fear. They crossed a narrow channel of open water, thin ice clinging to its edges, using driftwood planks as rafts. Channel, 2 feet of dark water edged by fragile ice, shards drifting like broken glass. Crozier led, balancing on a plank, pistol in hand. Just in case, Goodsir followed, clutching the journal so tightly his knuckles turned white. Midday light revealed ice cliffs high as cathedrals, each fold carved by centuries of wind and time. They passed a frozen waterfall. The flow stopped in midair. Droplets turned to crystal pendants. Each man stared, mesmerized by nature's cruelty and beauty entwined. They made camp once more as the sun dipped to a pale sliver on the horizon. Camp, 2 tents anchored with ice blocks, a tiny fire in between casting long shadows. Crozier dug a shallow pit for warmth, wrapping himself in furs while Goodsir tended the fire. The wind battered but could not extinguish the fragile flame. Goodsir wrote in his journal, "Our world is white, and our hopes fade like footprints on fresh snow. We march south to the river's mouth, if it still flows, toward a rescue we cannot yet see." His words hung in the air as the cold claimed his pen and his breath. They wrapped themselves in blankets, eyes never closing fully, each listening for the crack of ice or a whisper beneath the snow. They drifted into fitful dreams, hallways of ice, faces in the frost, a single bell tolling far away. As the gale raged outside, the Arctic silence pressed in tighter than any coffin. They had no maps now, only memory, guesswork, and a compass that twitched like it was nervous. The men followed Crozier, step by step, into an interior vastness more terrifying than the sea. No sails, no landmarks, No certainty that they'd ever cross paths with anything alive again. Just snow, sky, and a silence so deep it seemed to press into their ears like pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Time no longer moved in hours. It passed in frostbite, in blisters, in the strange color of blood when it touched the snow. Rations grew thin, boots were cut down and patched with skin, and still they moved forward, at first. Then they began to circle, not in great loops, but in subtle, awful ways. One night they passed a half-burned barrel, half buried in drift. They had seen it before, the same charring, the same indent where someone had carved the word home in a moment of absurd hope. "Didn't we pass this already?" someone asked, breath fogging. Crozier didn't answer. The Arctic had a cruel sense of humor. Around this time, men began to whisper of something following them. Not wolves, not Inuit, something else. Private Morphin claimed he saw a figure through the veil of snow, tall, white, and gliding across the ice with no sound and no tracks. Others told him he was hallucinating, and maybe he was. But then Lieutenant Littlejohn woke screaming one night, insisting he'd seen eyes just outside the tent. Black eyes, watching, waiting. Dr. Goodsir tried to soothe them. "Frost does strange things to the mind," he said gently, handing out willow bark tea that tasted like regret. "You're seeing shadows." But no one believed it, not entirely. The dreams began to change. They'd once been dreams of home, of warm bread and soft hearths. Now they were something else. Snow turning to teeth. A woman with black eyes singing lullabies no child should hear. A cracking sound, like ribs splitting under pressure. One man, unnamed, woke with his own scream lodged in his throat, unable to speak for 3 days. The men began leaving small offerings in the snow, a carved pipe, a ribbon, a gold ring. They buried them like charms, as if the thing, whatever it was, could be bribed, and the cold deepened. One morning, Crozier found 2 men frozen in their tent, not huddled together, sitting upright, facing one another, as if mid-conversation, their eyes wide, their tongues missing. They buried them without ceremony. There were no prayers left. The snowdrifts whispered now too, not in words, but in movements, a swirl where no wind blew, a footprint that melted before your eyes. Crozier began sleeping with his pistol loaded and unlatched beside his chest. When asked what he feared, he only said, "What's beneath? Not ahead, not behind, beneath." The weight of ice became unbearable. Every step sank a little deeper. Sometimes they thought they saw faces in the snow, just under the surface, like statues. Men from Erebus and Terror, perhaps, or not men at all. "Don't look too long," Goodsir said once. "It looks back." One man, Collins, went mad. He stripped naked in the blizzard and walked off muttering, "I hear it singing now." They found his boots the next day, filled with red snow. His body was never recovered. Then there was the night the snow turned black. It wasn't soot, it wasn't ash. It just changed, mid-blizzard. For 10 minutes, the flakes fell dark as coal. They melted the same, left no stain. But it was enough. No one spoke for hours after. The men moved more like shadows than soldiers. Crozier rationed silence more than food. If the thing hurt him, he reasoned, maybe it would let them go. But it didn't. It followed with patience. At one half-collapsed campsite, a crude totem was discovered. Bones tied in a spire, wrapped in scraps of uniform and twine. No man admitted to building it. No man touched it. But in the middle, someone had placed a human tooth. Clean, white, sharp as ivory? Crozier stared at it for a long time. That night, no one slept. The next morning, 2 more men were gone. No tracks, no blood, only steam rising from their blankets, as if they had only just stood and stepped into the whiteness. The truth was this: the ice had ceased being a place. It had become something more. It watched, it remembered, and worst of all, it waited. The expedition no longer feared starvation or frostbite. They feared the thing beneath, a hunger deeper than cold, a silence that listened, a void that imitated thought and form. And somewhere out there, in that endless tundra, something was learning the shape of men. By midsummer, only a dozen men remained, hollow faces carved by frost, eyes like dim lanterns in an endless white. The wind howled through drifted tents, a chorus of lost voices. Each dawn they rose, feeling the Arctic's weight pressing into their ribs. They trailed south under Captain Crozier's lead, direction meager hope, footsteps sinking into a world that swallowed sound. One night, beyond a battered ridge, they saw motion. An Inuit hunter standing at an icy outcrop, silent, surveying them with eyes like chipped obsidian. Then he vanished, stepping across the ice as though it were water. Crozier stared at empty sky and murmured, "Follow." They obeyed, hearts drumming like seals in the mist. They trailed the hunter's footprints over river ice that groaned under their weight. At midnight, a crescent moon cast a pale glow on fractured floes. When the ice cracked, Crozier halted them. They veered south to firmer ground, abandoning the thin sheet that threatened to swallow them whole. On the far side lay a small camp. No tents, only a circle of driftwood and half-burned seal oil lamps, candles snuffed out. Next to it, someone had carved symbols on a snowy stump, jagged runes, neither English nor Inuit. A few men knelt to touch them, feeling a fist tighten in their chests. They pocketed a splinter of carved wood, a talisman, or a curse. Further on was an abandoned Inuit village, huts of sod and bone, igloos half collapsed by snow. Ash-black fire pits whispered of warmth once found here. Children's toys, bone dolls, lay cracked and forgotten at doorways. One hut's interior held journals in a sealskin pouch, pages spattered with melted snow. The final entry read, "We saw it. It watched us from beneath the ice. We cannot stay." In another corner, Crozier found a crude painting on wood. A white phantom ship gliding between faces carved in glacier ice. Below, the artist scrawled, "The thing wakes." The men gathered in the dim light, sharing shriveled seal fat, chewing scraps of moss for sustenance. Muffled howls rose from the valley below, as if the land itself mourned them. At dawn, they climbed to a hidden valley, a rare hollow, dark as a bruise against the endless plains. Steam rose from hidden cracks. Ice moaned quietly. The hunter reappeared, beckoning them toward a glacier face braided with cobalt veins. Crozier knelt at its base, hands numb, and traced runes matching those in the camp. The hunter whispered a word Crozier did not understand, yet its meaning echoed, "Beware." They pressed on into the valley, every step a silent vow, of survival, of witness, and of memory. Behind them, the hunter vanished into the mist as if he were never there. As they marched, each man glimpsed shadows in the ice, forms half sewn into snow. Eyes flickered in the gloom. Some swore they saw voices form on the wind, soft murmurs of names not their own. One by one, they carved small tokens from bone, crosses, rings, a single silver dagger that glinted like a promise. They buried these charms beneath cairns of stones, as though the act could ward off the thing beneath. They pushed through a blizzard that turned day into night. A man named Beach fell behind, coughing blood into the snow. Crozier helped him rise, but the man's eyes were vacant. "Go on without me," he whispered. Crozier laid him against the drift, covered him with the failing tent flap, and did not look back. The rest staggered onward. By evening, they reached a frozen river mouth where Back River spilled into the sea. They saw fractured ice and the faint shimmer of distant water. Ahead lay the promise of rescue, or so they believed. But the Arctic had not finished teaching them fear. They camped by a rocky outcrop, for it was warmer than the open plains. In the gathering dusk, they built lean-tos from driftwood and ice blocks, lit small fires of seal oil, and shared a last meal of cold seal meat. They drank water from melted snow, each drop a miracle. The aurora returned, weaving ghostly ribbons of emerald and violet across the sky. They watched in stunned silence, half mesmerized, half afraid. In that eerie glow, they saw shapes swirling, figures in fur, faces pressed against the ice. A lullaby of voices drifted upward, but no words were heard. Below, the wind shifted and carried a hiss, like words too faint to catch. Crozier studied each face around the fire. Each man's heart beat with a shared dread, that the thing beneath had followed them here, that the ice still whispered truths they dared not know. That rescue, if it came, might come to empty shrouds rather than living bodies. As midnight neared, Crozier wrote in his journal by lantern light, "We reach the brink of hope. The ice still watches. Tomorrow we step into their lean-tos." The wind howled, the ice sighed, and in the darkness something moved beneath the valley's frozen floor, learning once more the shape of men. The morning broke pale as ash. Only 4 men remained of the original 129. Crozier, Fitzjames, Goodsir, and a private named Lynch. Their faces were hollowed by frost, their eyes faint lanterns in an endless white sea. Rations were exhausted. Boots were improvised from torn blankets. Coats were threadbare. Each man moved like a shadow in search of warmth that no longer existed. They reached Back River at dawn. The ice groaned before it yielded to dark, icy waters. Crozier knelt at the riverbank, cup in his shaking hands to drink. The water burned his throat, a shock of life in a wasteland of death. He retrieved a battered mess tin lodged in the snow. Inside, etched in fading ink, "Food's cached here. Hope persists." His heart thundered. He looked up and called, "We're saved." Fitzjames stumbled toward the cache, a small mound of leather packs containing dried seal, fish, and a half-frozen jug of molasses. Their eyes glistened as they grasped the tins, too frail to cheer. Goodsir felt tears freeze on his cheeks. Lynch, young, trembling, sipped the fish oil and murmured, "Sweet." It was the sweetest word he had ever spoken. They divided the provisions into 3 meager parcels. Crozier produced his final journal and pressed it into Fitzjames' hand. "If we do not emerge, let these words guide those who seek us." He tucked it beneath a slab of ice as a message to the world. The men knelt and offered a silent prayer to nothing, because the Arctic offered no gods, only ice that crushed dreams. They scavenged driftwood and broken beams to build a raft so frail it shivered with each gust of wind. Nails were replaced with bent rifle springs. Cordage was fashioned from seal sinew and ripped tent cloth. Each knot tied was a prayer. "Carry us, don't break." Each plank split left a promise to survive. They loaded the raft with their 3 parcels of food, their journals, and the silver dagger Crozier carried from Erebus, its blade etched for truth. The river current roared beneath the floes, an ebony ribbon dragging them north. Good Sir, trembling, rowed with a splintered oar. Crozier steered by the sun's pale glare. Lynch held at the bow, knees drawn, watching icebergs pass like ancient ghosts. Fitzjames sat in silence, gazing at the shattered remains of camps along the bank. Broken sledges, skeletal dog bones, letters pinned to driftwood. Hours passed in a haze of hunger and cold. The ice shifted, forcing frantic steering between cracking floes. A stray iceberg wallowed too close, scraping the raft's side, and a shiver traveled through the timbers. Lynch's teeth rattled. Crozier wrapped him in a scavenged blanket. "Rest," he whispered. Lynch closed his eyes, dreaming of home, warm kitchens, laughter, summer green. They beached at a tiny island around midnight, a jagged sliver of rock in a sea of white. Good Sir checked Lynch and pronounced, "He is gone." Lynch lay on a bed of fir boughs, his breath stilled, his face calm as stone. Crozier's knees buckled. "Another angel," he murmured, placing a shard of driftwood atop Lynch's body. A cross for the restless. Now 3 men remained. Crozier, Good Sir, Fitzjames. They shoveled Lynch's grave high, marking it with a cairn of stones. Then they set the raft back on the river, dragging it gently into the current. Each man tipped a helmet of water to his lips, pale liquid that tasted of memory and hope. Fitzjames willed himself to row, though the oar bit into his numb hands. Good Sir pressed a fragment of journal into Crozier's hand. "July 10th, 1848, we live. May this record be found." Crozier nodded. The river widened, ice floes scattering, an open pathway north. The icebergs grew taller, cathedral walls of blue and white. Some bore ancient runes, carvings from those who had vanished before, warnings in shapes no man recognized. They drifted past skeletal remains of sledges, rusted tins, and journals half buried in snow. Each relic whispered, "You could be next." At twilight, they spotted sails on the horizon, white shapes drifting across dark water. Crozier hammered the silver dagger into the mast's core, its etching catching the dying light. For truth. He waved frantically as Good Sir cupped his hands to shout. Fitzjames punched his chest, tears freezing on his lashes. By midnight, the whaler approached. Its deck heaved with life, warmth, laughter, smoke. Crozier and Good Sir poured out their story in broken words, salvage, hope. Fitzjames knelt on that deck, pressing snow to his eyes, murmuring, "I knew we would not die unseen." They were lifted aboard with blankets and hot broth, life after death. The Arctic hissed as the whaler's hull cut through ice, leaving their fragile raft behind. They watched it diminish, a ghost in a world of white. The Arctic would never let them go. Though rescued, their hearts remained locked in ice, a place of vanished triumph, whispered deaths, and secrets buried beneath 1,000-year cold. They were never truly alone, even when no ship appeared on the horizon, even when every map turned to lies, even when silence blanketed the men like snow. Something was watching. The surviving crew no longer marked days. The sun spun in a gray loop above them, unchanging. Their thoughts grew feral, minds unmoored by hunger and grief. They whispered of shadows that didn't match their source, footprints that circled their camp, then vanished, a presence that lingered just out of reach. The ice, they said, was alive. Crozier no longer dismissed such fears. His dreams were now thick with figures moving behind the frost, men with black eyes and cracked smiles, whispering in Inuktitut and Latin. At first, he called it madness, but then Fitzjames, pale and shaking, confessed he had seen them too, faces under the ice, staring up at me. Good sir, ever the man of reason, began sketching strange totems in his journal, loops and eyes, a spiral made from teeth. He said they came to him while he slept, pressing cold symbols into the backs of his eyelids. There's something beneath us, he whispered, not death, not life, something older. Their dwindling company had now broken into splintered fragments. One group, led by a desperate lieutenant, headed east with a prayer and no rations. Another disappeared into the mountains without a word. Crozier's party held fast to the river path. He clung to purpose like a lifeline, north, always north. The sea might open, a whaler might pass, and if not, they would vanish with dignity. But dignity frayed quickly. The men no longer spoke unless necessary. Their mouths were cracked, tongues sluggish with thirst. Snow had lost its softness. It cut like knives when swallowed. Crozier kept the last pages of his journal hidden in his coat. Each night he added a few shaky lines. Fitzjames still breathes. Good sir mutters prayers in broken Latin. I am afraid to sleep. They passed remnants of earlier camps, mounds of stone, tarnished buttons, scorched bone. One fire pit still bore the shape of a kneeling man. His shadow burned into the frost. The wind howled louder here. Good sir said it was the earth exhaling its secrets. One morning, they woke to find footprints circling them, bare, human, in the snow. Fitzjames insisted they'd seen no one. Crozier counted the men. No one missing. No one knew. Yet the prints were there, melting slowly in the pale light. Around and around they went, like a child pacing before sleep. No one slept that night. They crossed a frozen ridge by starlight. The sky above bloomed with aurora, green tendrils writhing like ghostly hands. Good sir wept softly at the sight. We're beneath heaven now, he whispered, and heaven doesn't look kindly on us. That night, Crozier dreamed of Erebus again. Not the ship, but the myth. The shadowed river that ferries souls into darkness. He stood at his shore while voices rose from the water. He recognized names: Franklin, Devoe, Hodgson, then his own. Francis Rawdon Crozier, the river hissed. Are you ready to cross? He woke screaming. Fitzjames tried to comfort him, but his hands trembled too violently. The younger man's health had worsened. Sores dotted his skin, and his breath came shallow. Crozier laid a hand on his shoulder. Hold on, he said. We're near something. I feel it. They stumbled upon a cairn near the shore, a pile of stones blackened by old fire. Underneath, a tiny tin box sealed in wax. Inside, a note written in neat cursive. Saw the ice move. It shifted of its own will. North no longer safe. Turn back. It was signed by a man long presumed dead. Fitzjames read it aloud, voice hoarse. The ice moved, he muttered. How does ice move on its own? Crozier pocketed the note without replying. He stared at the horizon, where the wind carved shapes through the mist. It looked almost like a man, walking just ahead, always out of reach. They set camp that night in a hollow beside a frozen stream. Good sir built a small fire, using his last fragments of journal. The flame hissed as if reluctant. Fitzjames leaned close, whispering, I feel it, you know. The watching? Crozier nodded. Above them, a ring of stars stared down, unblinking, ancient. You think we're the first? Fitzjames asked. No, Crozier whispered, just the latest. And then they fell silent again, the fire crackling between them as snow drifted down in slow whispering spirals. The ice made no sound, but it listened, and it remembered. They were never truly alone. Even when no ship appeared on the horizon, even when every map turned to lies, even when silence blanketed the men like snow, something was watching. The surviving crew no longer marked days. The sun spun in a gray loop above them, unchanging. Their thoughts grew feral, minds unmoored by hunger and grief. They whispered of shadows that didn't match their source, footprints that circled their camp, then vanished, a presence that lingered just out of reach. The ice, they said, was alive. Crozier no longer dismissed such fears. His dreams were now thick with figures moving behind the frost, men with black eyes and cracked smiles, whispering in Inuktitut in Latin. At first, he called it madness, but then Fitzjames, pale and shaking, confessed he had seen them too, faces under the ice, staring up at me. Good sir, ever the man of reason, began sketching strange totems in his journal. Loops and eyes, a spiral made from teeth. He said they came to him while he slept, pressing cold symbols into the backs of his eyelids. There's something beneath us, he whispered. Not death, not life, something older. Their dwindling company had now broken into splintered fragments. One group, led by a desperate lieutenant, he headed east with a prayer and no rations. Another disappeared into the mountains without a word. Crozier's party held fast to the river path. He clung to purpose like a lifeline. North, always north. The sea might open, a whaler might pass, and if not, they would vanish with dignity, but dignity frayed quickly. The men no longer spoke unless necessary. Their mouths were cracked, tongues sluggish with thirst. Snow had lost its softness. It cut like knives when swallowed. Crozier kept the last pages of his journal hidden in his coat. Each night he added a few shaky lines. Fitzjames still breathes. Good sir mutters prayers in broken Latin. I am afraid to sleep. They passed remnants of earlier camps, mounds of stone, tarnished buttons, scorched bone. One fire pit still bore the shape of a kneeling man. His shadow burned into the frost. The wind howled louder here. Goodsir said it was the earth exhaling its secrets. One morning, they woke to find footprints circling them, bare, human, in the snow. Fitzjames insisted they'd seen no one. Crozier counted the men. No one missing, no one knew. Yet the prints were there, melting slowly in the pale light. Around and around they went, like a child pacing before sleep. No one slept that night. They crossed a frozen ridge by starlight. The sky above bloomed with aurora, green tendrils writhing like ghostly hands. Goodsir wept softly at the sight. We're beneath heaven now, he whispered, and heaven doesn't look kindly on us. That night, Crozier dreamed of Erebus again. Not the ship, but the myth, the shadowed river that ferries souls into darkness. He stood at its shore while voices rose from the water. He recognized names, Franklin, DeVoe, Hodgson, then his own. Francis Rawdon Crozier, the river hissed. Are you ready to cross? He woke screaming. Fitzjames tried to comfort him, but his hands trembled too violently. The younger man's health had worsened. Sores dotted his skin, and his breath came shallow. Crozier laid a hand on his shoulder. Hold on, he said. We're near something, I feel it. They stumbled upon a cairn near the shore, a pile of stones blackened by old fire. Underneath, a tiny tin box sealed in wax. Inside, a note written in neat cursive. Saw the ice move. It shifted of its own will. North no longer safe. Turn back. It was signed by a man long presumed dead. Fitzjames read it aloud, voice hoarse. "The ice moved," he muttered. "How does ice move on its own?" Crozier pocketed the note without replying. He stared at the horizon, where the wind carved shapes through the mist. It looked almost like a man walking just ahead, always out of reach. They set camp that night in a hollow beside a frozen stream. Goodsir built a small fire, using his last fragments of journal. The flame hissed as if reluctant. Fitzjames leaned close, whispering, "I feel it, the watching." Crozier nodded. Above them, a ring of stars stared down, unblinking, ancient. "You think we're the first?" Fitzjames asked. "No," Crozier whispered. "Just the latest." And then they fell silent again, the fire crackling between them, as snow drifted down in slow whispering spirals. The ice made no sound, but it listened, and it remembered. By now, the silence had changed. It wasn't simply quiet anymore, it had texture. The men said so. It pressed against the skin like damp wool, seeped between their thoughts like fog, and made every shuffle of boots sound like cannon fire. Some whispered it was the silence of being watched. Others said it was the sound of dying too slowly to hear it. In the 6th week of this cursed encampment, the snow house appeared. It wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't a shelter they'd built or remembered building. And yet, there it was, round, white, half-sunken in drifts, slightly off from the neat rows of tents. At first, they assumed it was Crozier's men making an extra station, but no one admitted to it. The snow bricks were cut with clean, practiced lines. Too clean, not like theirs. A few joked, "Maybe it's the neighbors, should we knock?" Then the dogs began growling in the night, not at each other, not at the wind, but always facing the snow house. The first man to look inside never quite returned from it. His body did, thankfully, but his mind wandered off somewhere during the trip. He'd opened the flap one morning and stared inside for too long. When he stumbled back out, he wouldn't speak. Not that night, not the next. His eyes had fogged over like he'd looked straight into a lantern. He died 2 days later. No frostbite, no scurvy, just quiet. When they carried him out to bury, he smiled. A thin, crooked smile with blue gums. So the officers decided to demolish the thing. 3 men approached it with picks, but when they swung, their blades struck something far harder than packed snow, like ice pressed into bone. One of them dropped his tool and ran. The others tried to keep chipping, but gave up soon after. It wouldn't crack. No one went near it after that. They called it the Devil's Igloo in private, and those who drew tents close to it began shifting their sleep schedules to daylight hours. But what daylight? The sun had become a thing they described from memory, pale as parchment, shy as a dying candle. Some started to say the snow house was a kind of marker that it hadn't been made by men, but for them. A sign, maybe, or a door. "Have you ever seen snow fall without sound?" one sailor asked, lying flat in his sleeping bag, eyes wide as tea saucers. No wind, no rustle, not a single whisper, just 100,000 flakes dropping like they already know where you'll be buried. The older men, seasoned Arctic hands, refused to indulge the talk, but even they began shifting uncomfortably during meals and staring longer at the corners of the camp where shadows gathered like tired thoughts. And yet, life crept on. Routines persisted because there was nothing else to do. Meals were taken in silence. Letters were scribbled, though no one expected them to be sent. And always, always, the snow house waited. One evening, after yet another argument over dwindling rations, Lieutenant Irving was seen walking toward it. Just walking, calm as Sunday morning. Someone shouted after him. He didn't flinch. He never came back. A search party found only his boots, upright, side by side in the snow, no footprints, just the boots. It became a rule then. Do not look at it, do not speak of it, do not think about it before bed. Naturally, everyone did. Men began dreaming of it, vivid dreams of circular rooms and soft white walls, of voices that didn't echo, of hands reaching out of the ice, not grabbing, not violent, just resting on your shoulder like an old friend. Some said the dreams weren't dreams, they were rehearsals, and still the snow house stayed, never melting, never shifting, always in the corner of vision. Some men began making tiny replicas of it out of wax, bone, even food. They'd sculpt them quietly and hide them in their coats, as if building one gave you some control over the real thing. Or maybe they were trying to appease it, like worshippers who'd never seen their god, but still feared its face. The chaplain tried to intervene. He burned one of the models in front of the crew and read from the Psalms. That night, a wind tore his tent to ribbons, while the rest of the camp stayed still as sleep. He left the next day for the forward depot. Some said he ran. By now, there was no laughter at mealtimes. Even the jokes had gone brittle. The men still breathed, still worked, but the air between them felt thinner, like they were all walking on a frozen pond that might crack at any second. No one tried to destroy the snow house again. They didn't dare, because deep down, each man had the same unspoken thought, that the snow house hadn't been built by hands at all. It had been waiting for them. The tinned meat began to turn. It was subtle at first, just a glisten, a strange smell when the can hissed open, like wet copper and old breath. Most didn't notice or pretended not to. Hunger is a powerful negotiator, and rations were sacred. But the joke started to make its rounds. Don't ask what's in the stew unless you really want to know who's missing. They laughed. Kind of. At dinner, the tins lined up like soldiers, their dull gray lids flecked with rust, stamped with promises that now felt like lies. Best preserved by Her Majesty's provisioners, each can a small coffin holding meat that didn't smell quite like beef or pork or anything that belonged in the world. It had a sweet, sour sharpness, as if it had been stored in vinegar and regret. But the hunger was always louder than doubt, until the first man vomited blood. He was a strong sailor, all chest and beard, but after supper he went quiet, sat down by the canvas wall, and began to shiver. By morning, his teeth had fallen out into his porridge. He kept trying to chew, as if he didn't notice. The next day, he died. His gums were black, his fingers blue, his can of meat barely touched. They buried him, wrapped in canvas, just a few yards from the snow house no one spoke of anymore, not even in dreams. Then another man collapsed, then two more. Something was wrong, and everyone knew it. The tins weren't just turning, they were poisoning. Silent, efficient, merciless. The solder sealing them, they learned too late, was lead. The meat inside had stewed for months in metallic seepage, each mouthful a spoonful of madness. And they had been swallowing it eagerly, hungrily, for weeks. Lead creeps, it doesn't shout, it doesn't slash, it whispers from within, fogging the mind, unraveling thoughts like loose stitching. Soon, men began forgetting simple things. Names, orders, whether they'd eaten, whether they'd spoken out loud, or only imagined it. Some swore they saw lights in the snow, small blue sparks just above the ice. One sailor followed them for 3 hours before he was found, curled up like a child beneath a powdery drift, humming the anthem of the Royal Navy in reverse. Others grew irritable, quick to argue, slow to understand. Officers struggled to hold discipline. One moment a man would salute, the next he'd strip naked and start whispering to the stove like it owed him money. Crozier, already burdened with doubt, began keeping his gloves on at all times. No one questioned it. His hands trembled beneath them. The chaplain had written once that temptation came in many forms. Now it came in round metal tins, with twisted keys and rattling insides. The cooks tried boiling the meat longer, burying cans in the snow to purify them, even feeding small portions to the sled dogs to test for danger. But the dogs refused it, smart creatures. One growled when a sailor tried to force-feed it, then tore open the man's hand. They shot the dog, but the rest of the pack refused to come near the food again. The men started eyeing the dogs differently after that, less like pets, more like backup rations. One can exploded in the cold. The contents froze into a spiral that resembled a human tongue. The sailor who found it wouldn't eat for 3 days. On the 4th, he was caught licking a piece of canvas, muttering something about gravy and saints. Eventually, officers ordered a return to hardtack and salted fish. The tins were to be opened only in emergencies, but it was too late. The lead was already inside, already thinking for them. One man was caught hoarding tins beneath his mattress, dozens of them stacked like golden bricks. When asked why, he replied, "They sing to me at night." Then he cried when they took them away, sobbing like a child denied dessert. The strange thing was how some of the men grew fond of the lead-laced food. They developed a taste for it, said it made the dreams feel warmer. One even claimed it softened the cold. He died smiling, which unnerved everyone more than if he'd screamed. Meanwhile, supplies dwindled. The cold worsened. Memory became liquid, melting through fingers, running into dreams. They began confusing days with nights, the present with old conversations. Some wrote journals in gibberish. One man drew spirals on his cheeks with soot and declared he was becoming compass-born. Crozier, now hollow-eyed and ash-voiced, declared a new law: no man shall eat alone. It wasn't just a matter of fairness, it was safety, because no one trusted anyone anymore. Men began counting each other's tins, watching hands, listening for the click of a key opening a can after dark, and the snow house, it seemed closer. No one moved it, no one touched it, but it sat a few feet nearer than anyone remembered, just a whisper more in the corner of the eye. They said the lead makes your vision lie, but some weren't so sure. They started sleeping in shifts. It wasn't the cold or the hunger or even the wind, though the wind had begun to scream like something sentient, something offended. No, it was what happened in the dark. The dreams, the whispering, the shared suspicion that something was walking across the upper deck at night, slowly, deliberately, as if counting. So they formed watches, one man always awake, posted with a lantern and a journal, just in case. But just in case of what, no one would say. One man on the midnight watch carved tally marks into his boot heel. one for each shadow he couldn't explain. When they found him mumbling in a snowbank, his foot was bare, frostbitten black, the boot still warm where it had been clenched to his chest. The ship's groaned now, not just from the ice, but from within. Sounds that didn't travel like wood or rope, wet sounds, dragging sounds, something shifting in the bones of the ships. Some said it was the ice playing tricks. Others refused to comment, but every man knew Erebus and Terror were not empty, not anymore. Some spoke of a presence, though none could say what it looked like, just that it hovered, waited, listened. They gave it nicknames to lessen the fear. Old Growler, the Frozen Watchman. One man called it the Third Lieutenant and left offering of tobacco and biscuit near the ladder below deck. The biscuits disappeared, or so he claimed. Crozier tried to maintain order, even humor. He once toasted our invisible passenger with a cup of hooch and declared, "May he pay his mess dues in silence." It got a laugh, a weak one, but it was something. Still, more men grew sick. One began sleeping with a knife under his pillow. Another insisted his bunkmate had 2 sets of eyes and refused to lie near him. When he vanished one morning, no one looked for him. Not even a token search. The men had started accepting disappearances the way they once accepted snowfall, as something inevitable. And in the quiet hours, those unbearable stretching hours, where the lantern hissed and the wind howled through the seams, they began to hear footsteps that didn't belong to boots. Heavier, slower, sometimes slapping, sometimes scratching, sometimes breathing, but always behind them. When they turned, there was nothing. Or worse, something that had just moved. The night watch became a sentence, not a duty. No one volunteered anymore. They drew straws. The unlucky man would sit wrapped in fur and fear, trying not to blink too long, because every time he did, the shadows looked a little closer. The oil in the lantern seemed to burn faster, and the walls of the cabin seemed to lean in just a fraction. One sailor reported seeing a face in the condensation on the glass, his own, but smiling wider than humanly possible. When he wiped it away, it blinked. He didn't speak again. A note was later found in his pocket. It read only, "I dreamt of teeth that weren't mine." Some began to suspect each other. Eyes lingered longer. Words grew clipped. Every man a possible spy, or worse, a carrier of some creeping, soul-rotting thing. It wasn't just lead now, it was something else. Something beneath the ice, or maybe inside the ship, or inside them. Crozier wrote in his log that the dreams have taken on a shared vocabulary. Multiple men had described the same image, a tunnel made of ribs, a hallway of flesh, and at the end, a doorway made of spinning bones. They walked toward it in dreams. Always toward it, never through. One night, the watchman did not ring the change of shift bell. He had vanished from the upper deck, his lantern left lit, swinging gently from a hook. No tracks in the snow, no footprints leading away, just a single glove on the floor, fingers pointed back toward the ship. After that, 2 men were posted for each watch, then 3. Eventually, no one wanted to sleep, but sleep always found them. And in sleep, the ship grew strange. One man dreamed he was in a ballroom aboard Erebus, dancing with someone who had no face. Another dreamed he was cooking stew over a fire, stirring with a bone that hummed. A third awoke screaming, saying the ship had spoken to him, asked him to open something. When asked what, he wouldn't answer. He only wept. Eventually, the chaplain stopped preaching, said he was negotiating with a different employer now. He burned his Bible and began drawing symbols in charcoal on the walls of his quarters. When asked about them, he smiled too much and said, "Insurance." Crozier forbade all talk of spirits. He ordered journals to be collected. He began writing his own only in code. The officers whispered that even he had begun sleeping in shifts, not for safety, but because he feared what he might dream, and so they lived in flickering light and deepening shadow. Day indistinguishable from night. Silence from hallucination. Only the watches remained constant. Every few hours, a bell would ring, somewhere in that buried hive of wood and fear. It was February now, or at least they thought it was. No sun for weeks, just the gray that hung overhead like an old bedsheet, too heavy to lift, too familiar to question. Clocks had long stopped being trusted. The days and nights slid into one another like cards in a magician's hand. Shuffle, vanish, repeat. Inside terror, the temperature dropped again. Frost traced delicate feathers along every beam, and breath hung like smoke from tired mouths. Even the rats had disappeared, which should have been a relief, but wasn't. Crozier ordered quiet, less talking, less speculation. It was an official policy now, inked into the ship's log in a tight, shaking hand. No mention of dreams, noises, or vanishing things unless directly relevant to duty. They called it the Doctrine of Silence. The men laughed at the name at first, until they realized it was no joke. The chaplain, now fully unmoored, walked the corridors, repeating the phrase under his breath like a hymn. One night, he painted it on his own eyelids in soot and was found grinning in his bunk, whispering, "Can't see it if you don't speak it?" A cook's assistant muttered to himself during meal prep and was put in confinement. He screamed about wood that bleeds until he passed out. His soup that day had gone untouched. And then there was the door. Midshipmen began to avoid a particular hatch near the engine room. It had always stuck a bit, but now it creaked open when no one touched it. One sailor swore he heard a knock from the other side. Polite as a butler, Crozier ordered it sealed with iron bolts and refused to speak of it again. One man kept a journal of rules. It grew longer each day. The last few entries read, Rule 37, don't look in mirrors. Rule 38, don't answer questions you didn't hear asked. Rule 39, if someone hums and you don't recognize the tune, leave the room. Rule 40, if the room follows, run. The dreams had worsened. The tunnel made of ribs now had voices echoing down it. Some said they were the voices of men already dead. Others thought they sounded like family, mothers, brothers, old lovers. One man said his dog from boyhood spoke to him and asked him to come inside the tunnel. Just for a moment, he woke sobbing. More of them began sleeping on the floor, fearing the bunks. One night, a sailor claimed he had been lifted from his mattress and dropped. He showed bruises shaped like handprints, thick ones, too thick. Crozier finally removed all the rum. He said it was poisoning judgment. The men disagreed violently, and a fight broke out in the galley that ended with one sailor losing 2 fingers. Not to a blade, but to a bite. No one blamed the biter, not really. He apologized, sobbing. Said he thought the man was a fish, said he was hungry, said it wouldn't happen again. There was talk now of leaving, not officially, no orders, no mutiny, but in quiet pairs on night watch, in whispered tones between cracked lips. South, some said. find help, find land, find something that isn't this. They'd all read the survival books. They knew the distances. They knew what ice did to ankles, what frost did to lungs, but a few said they'd rather freeze free than rot in place. The officers tried to hold rank. Morning musters continued, though attendance thinned. Sick bay, some claimed, needed rest. No one checked. Crozier met nightly with Fitzjames and a shrinking group of lieutenants. The meetings grew more strained, more surreal. Discussions about food inventories would slip into arguments about dreams. One man tried to chart them, convinced they formed a pattern, a map. Where does it lead? Crozier asked flatly. To the inside, the man replied, eyes hollow. Another suggested they open the strange hatch again, just to check. He was removed from duty. One night, Crozier walked the length of Erebus alone, just once, just to feel what it was like. He said later he saw nothing unusual, but his eyes were bloodshot for days. By the end of February, if it was February, the doctrine of silence had become more than policy. It was ritual, a superstition, a lifeline. Men would leave the galley in silence, hold their breath when walking past the sealed door, and knock 3 times before entering their own cabins. Some placed buttons in their mouths while sleeping, claiming it tricked the whispers. Others refused to sleep at all. When Fitzjames proposed an early departure across the ice, Crozier declined. We'd only take it with us, he said. No one asked what it was. They all understood, without needing to name it. The thing that watched without watching. The thing that waited when you turned your back. The thing that might have followed them from open sea, or worse, never left the shipyard to begin with. And so they stayed. 2 ships locked in ice. 100 men unraveling by candlelight. And above it all, the doctrine of silence. Fragile, flickering, sacred. The only thing louder than fear was pretending it wasn't there. March came like a rumor. No one could quite agree when it arrived, only that it had. It didn't feel like spring. It felt like something watching spring from behind a curtain of frost, uncertain if it should show itself. The sun, a pale disk, finally returned in brief slices, but the men didn't cheer. Light only made the shadows more convincing. With illumination came detail, and not all of it was welcome. Some had hoped that seeing the horizon again would revive morale, but the sight of endless white, broken only by jagged ridges of pressure ice, sent a different message. There is nowhere left to go. And the noises continued. It started as tapping, always at night, always in threes, tap, 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 then silence. Sometimes it came from the outer hull, like knuckles rapping politely on cold metal. Other times, it seemed to come from the beams above, or beneath the floorboards, as if the ship were being gently knocked on from below. Fitzjames joked, once, that the ice was trying to borrow sugar. No one laughed. Crozier stared at him for a long time. Soon after, one of the Marines, Corporal Dayton, refused to enter the lower decks at all. He said he saw someone walking ahead of him in the passageway. Said the man turned a corner and disappeared, but left no footprints. He described the figure as wearing a hat. That was all. He was confined to quarters after he began repeating the phrase, "Hats don't float," over and over. Then came the humming. It drifted through the air like smoke, too soft to trace. No melody, just a single note stretched long and low. It came from no direction. It moved when followed. Some tried to hum back. One man claimed it harmonized with him. He stopped speaking shortly after. Food stores continued to shrink. Salt pork had taken on a strange taste. Sweet, almost floral. Men swore it was changing. Crozier ordered random inspections, but nothing could be proven. The meat looked the same. It just didn't feel the same. A barrel of preserved lemons was found rotted and empty. The cooper swore it had been full the day before. There were no puddles, no signs of leakage, just a hollow cask and the faint smell of vinegar and ash. Captain Fitzjames began to host evening story hours in the officers' mess. Light-hearted tales of former voyages, sea monsters, minor mutinies, all recited with exaggerated flair. But even these grew twisted. One tale ended with a crewman swallowed whole by his own reflection. Another described a ghost ship that fed on laughter. Crozier asked him to stop. Fitzjames agreed, but that night the humming returned, louder. Some swore they heard it coming from his cabin. Outside, the temperature dropped further. The ice thickened, cracked, moaned. Some said it sounded like whales crying. Others said it sounded like men. A carpenter's mate reported a figure kneeling at the bow during a snow squall. He assumed it was one of the lookouts and called him. The figure turned, then dissolved. Not walked, not ran, just faded like smoke and wind. He didn't report for duty the next day. When questioned, he only said he didn't have eyes. One of the stokers drew maps of things that weren't on any chart. Strange islands, twisted coastlines. He said they came to him in dreams. Crozier confiscated the drawings and locked them away. Later that night, someone broke into his office and stole them back. The lock was undamaged. The door, however, had been scratched. Deep, curved scratches, 3 of them. The medical tent, erected on the ice now due to rising cases of cabin madness, began to fill, not with the sick, but with the silent, men who no longer spoke, who stared too long, who flinched when touched. Dr. Goodsir kept meticulous notes, but even he began omitting certain symptoms. "They won't believe me," he whispered once. "I barely believe me." One patient, a young steward, claimed he saw a dog made of ice. "It followed him," he said. "It licked his hand and froze it." He showed Goodsir the burn. It was real. Crozier began sleeping with his boots on, not for escape, but for the dream, the one where the ship split open and swallowed him. In the dream, his boots kept getting caught on the teeth, and the door, the one they sealed below decks, someone opened it. The bolts were still in place, the seal intact, but the door stood ajar. No one confessed, no one even asked. They just nailed it shut again. Not opened, not read, just placed. The doctrine of silence remained unbroken, but it warped. Men now spoke in riddles to avoid saying what they really meant. "How's the weather?" became, "Have you seen it?" "Good night" became, "Be warm." And when someone said, "See you in the morning," they didn't always mean it kindly. The ships groaned in their icy vice. The men moved like ghosts, eyes dulled, ears pricked, hearts stuttering. Something was changing. It wasn't just madness. It was arrival. April 1848. The ice would not move. It had gripped the ships for over a year now, longer than any of them had truly accepted. There had always been hope, unspoken but persistent. The thaw would come, the ice would crack, and Erebus and Terror would drift forward once more, bruised perhaps, but unbeaten. But the thaw came, and the ice stayed. The decision was not made suddenly. It built like pressure beneath snow. Rumors first, then whispers, then grim discussions behind closed doors, and then the note. It was sealed in a tin cylinder and left beneath a stone cairn on King William Island, a message for the living, or perhaps the dead. April 25th, 1848, the ships Erebus and Terror were deserted, total loss. 105 souls under the command of Captain Crozier deserted. Not a word sailors like to use, but it was true. They had no choice. Erebus and Terror were no longer ships. They were tombs wrapped in wood and iron. The men packed what they could, sledges piled high with food, weapons, instruments, and books. Always books, always that stubborn English dignity, even in death. Some took silver cutlery. One man packed a hairbrush. They marched with frozen boots. Some wept, others sang. A few kissed the ship's hull as they stepped off for the final time. Superstition or farewell, it was hard to tell. Crozier led him, face gaunt, eyes bloodshot from nights with no sleep and colder dreams. Beside him, Fitzjames had grown pale, his once glossy hair now brittle and graying at the temples. He smiled at the men when they passed him, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The sledges were absurdly heavy. Some weighed over 600 pounds. Goods stacked high like moving altars to empire, china cups, writing desks, crates of tea. The route they chose was desperate. A long trek across King William Island toward the Great Fish River, hundreds of miles to the south. But the land was jagged, broken and blanketed in wind-blown snow. They could barely see 10 yards ahead. The sun glared like a searchlight from behind the clouds, and the shadows of the men stretched long and thin like specters walking alongside them. The Inuit say that the land is alive, that it listens. Some among the crew had started to believe them. A low fog began to follow them, despite no change in wind. It clung low to the ice, threading between boots and dragging behind sledges like smoke from an unseen fire. When they stopped to rest, the fog stopped too. One night, Crozier reported hearing bells in the distance. He assumed it was Frost playing tricks, but several others heard it as well. The sound faded before it could be found. Another man saw lights on the horizon, green and flickering, like lanterns swaying in invisible hands. He dropped his sledge and wept. They let him cry. And then the deaths began. The first to fall was Private Johnston. His legs simply failed beneath him. When his boots were removed, his toes were already gone, snapped clean off as if made of chalk. He was buried in a snowbank, marked with a tin spoon. No one had the strength to dig. Then went Lieutenant Hodgson. His lungs gave out. Good Sir performed a brief examination and noted that his tissue had turned a strange shade of blue-green, as if colored by the aurora itself. More followed. Each death seemed to lighten the sledges, but darken the march. Men began leaving things behind, forks, buttons, photographs. They whispered apologies to the items before dropping them. By the end of the week, one sledge had only a single object, a Bible. Its pages had been torn out to start fires, one by one. Crozier no longer gave speeches. He walked in silence, lips moving in prayer, or perhaps argument, with something no one else could see. One afternoon, a man screamed and pointed to a set of tracks beside their path. He said they looked like hooves, but too wide, like a horse, but crawling. No one found the tracks. Another man claimed he saw Erebus behind them, slowly gliding over the ice. "She's coming for us," he whispered. "She wants her crew back." When asked later, he could not recall saying it. By the third week, the fog had names. The men whispered to it. Some claimed it whispered back. Fitzjames wrote in his journal, "There is something walking parallel to us, just beyond the range of sight. I do not say this in fear, I say it as one speaks of weather, a certainty we now plan around." Food was running out. The tinned meat had developed a smell, sweet, sour, metallic. A few still ate, most could not. Good Sir refused to speak of the meat anymore. One morning, a man was found dead beside the fire. Not frozen, not starved. His eyes were open, mouth agape, and his hands still gripped a spoon. He had simply stopped being. No wound, no warning. The next night, no one slept. The fog thickened, the bells rang again, and someone, no one would say who, asked aloud, "What if the ships never wanted us to leave?" They pressed deeper inland, where nothing moved but ice and memory. 3 remained, Crozier, Good Sir, and a private named MacLeod. Fitzjames had gone days earlier, wounded by frost while gathering driftwood. He had wandered off toward a ridge and vanished. They found his footprints ending at a fissure in the ice. No one ever saw him again. His rifle lay abandoned, still loaded. Now, a slim line of tracks led southward, trailing off into white infinity. The river had become a frozen road, mouth sealed by ice floes. They followed its unnatural straightness, drawn by the promise of open water beyond. Rations were gone. All that remained was crumbs of biscuit, a flask of half-frozen rum, and a single tin of peas pudding. They ate carefully, rationing every spoonful. Even the peas pudding tasted of regret, grainy, metallic, impossible to swallow without wincing. MacLeod grew thin as wind-blown snow. He slept only in fits, twitching, mumbling of voices calling his name from beneath the ice. He scratched symbols into the hilt of a knife, circles and scratches that matched nothing. He died one dawn, clutching a spoon, a silent rattle in his chest, as though even breathing had betrayed him. They buried him in the ice with a handful of coal for warmth. Crozier marked the grave with a split oar. It was a poor marker, but he hoped the sun might find it someday. Good Sir refused to speak of the grave. He walked away, tears frozen on his cheeks. Now only 2 remained, Crozier and Good Sir. Each step was agony, joints screaming, lungs burning, skin numb to pain. Their world was a dead white painting, every feature eroded by frost. They found an Inuit cairn by the river's edge. Beneath it lay a small cache, a pouch of dried fish, a carved bone knife, a fragment of sealskin. They took them gratefully, though the thought of eating dried fish again made their stomachs turn. Good Sir brewed a thin broth of melted snow and dried fish, adding a teaspoon of rum to each bowl. They spooned it silently, the liquid warming their bellies like a bitter promise. Crozier studied Good Sir's face. Once they had joked about the world. Now even jokes felt distant. He asked, "Will this end?" Good Sir did not answer. He merely trembled, his eyes fixed on the swirling broth. Afternoon came in a haze. They rose and continued south, following a jagged valley carved by glaciers. The walls of ice glowed pale blue. Every sound echoed, a drip of melting ice, a crunch of footsteps, a whisper of wind. It was as if the earth itself spoke in a language they could scarcely understand. Night fell quickly. They made a lean-to of canvas over driftwood, huddling together for warmth. Crozier pressed his cold pack against Good Sir's chest. "Hold on," he whispered, though his own voice cracked. Good Sir shivered and muttered a line from a psalm. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. He coughed, the sound jagged and wet. Crozier handed him the flask. We are here, Crozier said, and we are alive. Goodsir nodded, eyes half closed. But for how long? He whispered. The answer was in the wind. He awoke at dawn, face wet with tears. Crozier was gone. He found him a few paces beyond the tent, on his knees in the snow, head bowed. Crozier's footprints led in a circle. Goodsir said, Sir John? But Crozier did not look up. When Goodsir reached him, Crozier whispered, I thought I saw something beyond the horizon, something alive. He pointed north. Under a blanket of snow, Goodsir saw shapes, tall, thin shapes like poles or broken tombstones swaying in the Arctic wind. Before Goodsir could speak, Crozier stood and stumbled south without a word. Goodsir called after him, but Crozier did not stop. He watched Crozier's footprints vanish into the whiteness, leading toward something beyond knowing. Then he turned back to the tent to gather what little remained. His journal, a pen, a scrap of shell from a discarded wave. As he packed, Goodsir heard Crozier's voice carried faintly on the wind. He's deeper than the ice, right under us. He stuffed the journal into his coat and set out after Crozier. He followed those footprints, each step heavier than the last, until he found Crozier standing at the edge of a jagged hole in the ice. Dark, yawning, as if the ocean had gasped and fallen away. Beneath, water flowed, black and silent. In the depths, faint ripples radiated outward like a pulse. Goodsir knelt beside the hole, peering into its depths. He had glimpsed faces here before, bodies frozen in the current. This hole was different. It felt alive. Crozier knelt beside him. It's calling, he whispered, calling us home. Home. A place they could no longer reach. They sat together in deafening silence. The Arctic sky bruised overhead, the world holding its breath. Two men, survivors of a doomed expedition, stared into the dark veins of a frozen sea, waiting to see what might emerge. There were names carved into a stone, not by the Inuit nor by any natural hand. Just crude etchings, Latin letters, shallow, fragile things, chipped with a pocket knife or a chisel against a lonely rock that jutted from the snow like a broken tooth. Crozier, Goodsir, Baxter. Fitzjames's name was half finished, only FITZ before it trailed off in a weak hand. Snow had gathered in the grooves, the names filled with cold, like graves left open to the sky. The two survivors, just Crozier and Goodsir now, stood staring at them. Neither spoke. The sky above swirled in gray bruises. Ice fog curled low along the ground like creeping fingers. The wind moaned through nearby cliffs like it was telling them to turn back, but there was nowhere left to turn. Their legs ached with the rhythm of dragging the last sledge. Inside it, nothing but a single tent, the journal, and a tin of nails. What once held supplies and spoils now carried only proof that someone, somewhere, had endured, or tried. Crozier whispered, "We leave our names because our bodies will disappear." Goodsir didn't reply. He was squinting toward the south, where the coast should be, trying to imagine warm currents and people. But the horizon was a smear of white, no sea, no sky, just a curtain of pale nothing. That night, they lit a final fire with the remains of a broken mast. The wood hissed as if reluctant to burn, and the flames threw shadows taller than tents across the glacial walls. Crozier sat close, his coat pulled tight, gloves off, hands bare, turning slowly red from the heat. He said, "We were explorers, men of science, of Empire Good Sir stirred the embers. "We were just men," he said. "No one will remember anything but the failure." Crozier chuckled, low and bitter. "Then we've done something memorable after all." The fire spat. Behind them, something cracked. Just the ice, probably. Still, they both turned their heads, slowly, deliberately, listening. Something in the way the wind moved suggested more than wind. A shift, a shuffle, like boots on old snow. But when they looked, there was nothing. Only the sledge. Only the names on the rock, catching firelight in their letters. They barely slept. Each hour was a trance, half dream, half vigil. The cold crept deeper into their joints. Even blinking became an effort, and somewhere beneath the hush, they began to feel the weight of the silence. A silence shaped like something watching. When the dawn came, thin and blue, Crozier walked off without speaking. Good Sir followed. They left the fire behind, still faintly glowing. They trudged toward a black ridge. The ice there was older, harder, marked by strange patterns, as if tides had risen and fallen over centuries, carving ancient secrets into its face. There were no birds, no tracks, only long, smooth furrows, like fingers had dragged through the snow. They passed a cairn made from shattered barrels. Someone, maybe from Erebus, had tried to signal. The stones were arranged in a spiral. At the center, a scrap of red cloth flapped in the breeze. Good Sir approached it carefully, as if it might be alive. Pinned beneath the cloth was a page torn from a field manual. On it, a drawing of a bird, wings outstretched, ox maybe. The ink had bled. The image looked like a scream. Crozier looked away. "Leave it," he muttered. They pressed on. The snow deepened. Every step pulled at them like wet sand. They paused often. Their skin was pale and cracked. Good Sir's lips were dark. Crozier had a nosebleed that wouldn't stop. He wiped it on his sleeve, leaving a red crescent. They saw it at dusk. The remnants of a camp, not theirs, scattered canvas, a dented pot, bones buried under drift. Human? They didn't ask. They didn't want to know. A jacket still fluttered, pinned beneath ice. Good Sir picked it up. Inside the breast pocket, he found a medal, gold with the Queen's profile. He stared at it a moment, then let it fall back into the snow. Crozier finally said what they'd both been thinking. "None of us were meant to return," and Good Sir, smiling faintly, replied, "Some part of us will, just not the warm parts." That night, the sky turned green. Aurora streamed across the heavens like veins in the skull of God. They watched it in silence. The colors danced, flickered, shimmered, and for the first time in weeks, Crozier cried. He did not hide it. Good Sir placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let it happen," he said. "Just the cold leaving you." The wind picked up. In the distance, wolves howled. Or maybe it was something else. Something stranger. A memory of wolves, echoing back through frozen centuries. Crozier whispered, "Let it take us gently." Good Sir nodded. They sat side by side, eyes open, watching the sky unravel into fire. And somewhere behind them, the snow sighed. The last embers of hope flickered in their eyes as they wandered toward the shore, where broken ice met dark open water. Crozier, catechizing the frigid wind, shoulders stooped, steps labored. Good Sir followed, journal pressed like a shield, pen poised in trembling fingers. The sea called them now, a final promise or a final condemnation. Before them lay an inlet partially thawed, pocked with ice floes drifting like pale ghosts. Beyond, a faint silhouette, a ship, its sails slack but alive, smoke curling from its funnel. They blinked, hearts pounding. Rescue. Yet the distance seemed both too near and impossibly far. An apparition conjured by delirium. Crozier collapsed on one knee, visions swimming with memories, farewell letters, broken sledges, snow house horrors, and the names etched in stone. He glanced at Good Sir, who smiled with tears glistening on cheeks cracked by frost. No words were needed. They limped forward, each breath a labor of faith. Crouched on a shattered lifeboat, a whaler's crew clustered in heavy coats, watching. When Crozier lifted his arm, a thin cry tore from his chest, an echo of triumph and shame. The whaler's launch lurched through icy water, smashing between floes until it grounded on a narrow spit. 5 sailors jumped on ice and slid toward them with ropes and blankets. A sailor knelt beside Good Sir, draping a woolen coat over his shoulders, shielding him from a cold that gnawed at bones. Another handed Crozier a steaming mug of tea, its warmth like liquid gold. Crozier's teeth rattled as he sipped, vision clearing. He realized the world had color: blue sky, white ice, dark water, crimson tea, each a gift. As they were lifted aboard, Crozier felt the deck shudder beneath him. He closed his eyes, holding tight to Good Sir's hand. The deck crew murmured questions. "Are you injured? Can you speak?" But he only nodded, unable to find a voice strong enough to suit the moment. Below, in the smithy, a lantern swung. The first mate asked tenderly, "Cold? Hungry? You all right?" Crozier nodded again, tears spilling. He turned his head away, staring out the scuppers at the receding ice. The whaler moved slowly north, forging a frail path through floes that yawed and crashed like dying breaths. The survivor's eyes scanned each horizon for others, somewhere perhaps a faint shape behind mist or a lone boot print carving toward them. Good Sir, wrapped in blankets, sat on the quarterdeck, writing in his journal. His pen hovered over the page, words forming a prayer, a promise, and a warning. Crozier watched him, stunned by the steady scratch of ink. "Take it to the world," Good Sir whispered. "Tell them what the ice sings." Crozier nodded, voice trapped in snow-choked lungs. He fingered the silver sextant in his pocket and felt its weight. It measured distance, direction, but here had pointed only to oblivion. Now it pointed to survival, or a chance at survival. Below, the wind carried a gull's cry, sharp, alive. Crozier inhaled, tasted salt and hope. He turned to Good Sir. "Will you join me?" he asked. Good Sir nodded, penning one last line. "The ice will keep its secrets, but we will not bury our tongues." They stood at the rail as the bowsprit cut through black water, the ice collapsing behind in thunderous cascades. Each roar felt like a final exhalation. They held their breath, waiting for the world to end or begin anew. And in that moment, the Arctic seemed to whisper, "You may leave, but we remain within you. We are the hollow names of men who vanished. We are the hush that follows every step." They watched the ice recede until it was just a wall of white on the horizon, then a seam, then nothing. The sun lowered, painting the sky in bruised gold. Crozier pressed the sextant to his chest, felt its cold metal pulse with life. He turned to Good Sir and said, "We go home." Good Sir smiled, closing his journal. "Home," he echoed, though the word sounded foreign. The deck vibrated as the whaler's engines fired. Steam filled the air, mingling with laughter and shouts of the crew. Mercy, for once, felt real. Above them, the sky glowed pink, a promise of warmth. They knew healing would be slow, that nightmares might linger, yet hope bloomed where there had only been ice. Crozier and Goodsir stood side by side, watching the bow swing through open water, the world sprawling beyond their broken edges. They had crossed the frozen heart of oblivion and were being carried back to life. And though the Arctic would wait for new stories, new souls, it would remember them, for they were the ones who returned. Days later, as they stepped onto wharf and felt wood under heeled boots, they heard bells echo across harbor, each toll a reminder, life persists. They carried scars, both seen and unseen, ghosts in their bones, names whispered by the wind. Yet each sunrise, each breath of warm air, reminded them they had won a grim lottery. They were alive to tell the true tale of ice. Always onward, ... As the Arctic sun dips beneath an endless horizon, remember this: Erebus and terror may lie beneath the ice, but their story lives on in every frozen gust, in every whispered name etched in stone. Crozier and Goodsir returned to warm hearths, yet carried the hush of that frozen world in their bones. Tonight, when the wind sighs through your window and the shadows stretch long across your blankets, know that somewhere beyond the edges of a gentle dream, ice still shifts with secrets. Echoes of ships that vanished once, and men who learned too late that some doors don't close softly. May you sleep knowing the cold cannot claim you. May your thoughts drift to distant tundras and silent cairns, where the names of the lost linger like frost on a window pane. And should you ever hear a faint tapping in the night, remember, some knocks are not altogether unwelcome, for they keep memory alive. This has been Sleepless Thrills, where history's darkest whispers become a lullaby. If you've stayed with us until the last ember flickered, thank you. Tap that like button, no really, because out in the ice, the men wished someone had thought of sending smoke signals. Hit subscribe and ring the bell, lest your hearth grow cold and your curiosity wander too far. Until next time, dear traveler, sleep softly, dream deeply, and let the echoes of the ice guide you home. Good night, if you can still hear me.